There's a moment in every major political scandal when the walls stop being theoretical and start closing in for real. And what happened in that courtroom wasn't just another headline. It was the kind of moment that changes trajectories. Ivanka Trump's passport was confiscated, not requested, confiscated. And it happened within hours of her stepmother Melania speaking to investigators behind closed doors. If you think those two things aren't connected, you haven't been paying attention to how these investigations actually work. Let me walk you through what just happened, why it matters more than you might think, and what it tells us about where this is all heading. First, the facts. Ivanka Trump appeared in court. The proceedings were tied to an ongoing investigation, the details of which have been partially sealed. But the core involves financial transactions, potential fraud, and questions about the valuation of assets tied to the Trump organization. This isn't new territory. We've heard about these investigations for months. But what is new is the escalation. During the hearing, prosecutors made an application to the judge. They argued that Ivanka posed a flight risk. That term, flight risk, is not used lightly. It's a legal designation that means the court believes there's a genuine possibility the person might flee the jurisdiction to avoid legal consequences. The judge agreed, and Ivanka's passport was surrendered to the court right there. Now let's talk about Melania. Because the timing here is not coincidental. Just hours before Ivanka's court appearance, Melania Trump was seen entering a federal building in Washington. No cameras inside, no public statement afterward, but multiple sources confirmed she was there for a voluntary interview with investigators. Voluntary is an interesting word in this context. It often means someone is cooperating, either because they want to or because they've been advised that cooperation is their best option. What did Melania say? We don't know, but we know what she could say. She's been present for years of private conversations. She's been in the room when decisions were made. She's had access to documents, to communications, to the inner workings of both the family and the business. And she's also someone who, legally speaking, has her own interests to protect. Here's where it gets more interesting. Melania and Ivanka have never had what you'd call a warm relationship. There's been reporting over the years, carefully sourced, about tension, about competition for influence, about fundamentally different views on how things should be handled. They're not allies, they're not confidants. And in a situation like this, where legal exposure is real and everyone is looking out for themselves, that matters. So when Melania goes in to talk to investigators, and then within hours, Ivanka's passport gets taken, you have to ask yourself, what was said in that room? Did Melania provide information that changed the government's assessment of the risk Ivanka poses? Did she corroborate something investigators already suspected but couldn't prove? Did she offer testimony that directly implicates Ivanka in conduct that makes flight a legitimate concern? We don't have answers yet, but the sequence of events tells a story. Let's talk about what confiscating a passport actually means in legal terms. It's not the most severe restriction a court can impose. Ivanka hasn't been detained, she hasn't been arrested, but it's a significant step. It means the court has determined that without this measure, there's a real risk she might leave the country. And once you're designated a flight risk, other restrictions often follow. Reporting requirements, restrictions on movement, increased scrutiny. It also signals something else. It signals that prosecutors believe they have enough evidence, or are close enough to having enough evidence, that preventing someone from leaving the country is justified. You don't take someone's passport on a hunch. You do it when you think charges are coming, and you need to make sure the person is still around when they do. Now think about the broader context. The Trump family has spent years operating in a very specific way. Aggressive legal strategies, delay tactics, public attacks on investigators. And when things get too hot, the ability to move, to relocate, to operate from somewhere outside the reach of U.S. law enforcement. That's not speculation. That's been part of the playbook for people in similar situations throughout history. Ivanka has properties overseas. She has business connections in multiple countries. She has resources that most people facing legal trouble simply don't have. And prosecutors know this. So when they go to a judge and say, we need to take her passport, they're not being overly cautious. They're responding to a real risk based on real capability. But here's the deeper question. Why now? These investigations have been ongoing for a long time. Evidence has been accumulating, witnesses have been interviewed, documents have been subpoenaed. So why does the flight risk calculation change at this particular moment? One possibility is that Melania provided something specific. A piece of testimony that connects dots prosecutors needed connected. A corroboration of financial records that had previously been disputed. An account of a conversation or a meeting that establishes intent or knowledge. Any of those things could shift the entire posture of an investigation. Another possibility is that prosecutors are closer to bringing charges than anyone outside the investigation realizes. And if you're about to indict someone, you make sure they can't leave. You don't wait until after the indictment is unsealed and risk them being on a plane to a country with no extradition treaty. There's also a psychological element here that shouldn't be overlooked. When you take someone's passport, you send a message. Not just to that person, but to everyone around them. You're saying, we're serious, we're not going away. And you should be thinking very carefully about your own situation. That message reverberates. Other potential witnesses see it. Other people involved in the same conduct see it. And some of them start thinking about their own legal exposure and whether cooperation might be a better path than defiance. Let me take you back to something Rachel Maddow said years ago about how these cases work. She was talking about a different investigation, but the principle holds. She said that in complex white-collar cases, you often don't see the whole picture until very late. Evidence gets built piece by piece, witness by witness, document by document. And then there's a moment when everything clicks into place and the pace accelerates dramatically. We might be in one of those moments because taking Ivanka's passport isn't an isolated action. It's part of a sequence. Melania goes in. Hours later, Ivanka's movement is restricted. Those things are connected by more than just timing. They're connected by strategy. Prosecutors in cases like this often use what's called a pressure campaign. You bring in witnesses who might have useful information. You make it clear what the stakes are. You offer cooperation agreements to some and let others know that the window for cooperation is closing. And you take visible steps, like confiscating passports, that send a signal to everyone involved. The signal is simple. This is real. This is moving forward. And you need to decide where you stand. Now let's talk about what this means for Ivanka specifically. She's been, for years, the most polished member of the Trump family in public. Calm, composed, careful with her words. She's cultivated an image of being somehow separate from the more chaotic elements of her father's political and business operations. But that image and the legal reality are two different things. If prosecutors believe she was involved in fraudulent activity, if they have evidence of her signing documents, approving valuations, participating in meetings where decisions were made that crossed legal lines, then the polished public image doesn't matter. What matters is what the evidence shows. And here's the thing about white-collar fraud cases. They're built on documents, emails, contracts, financial statements, testimony about who knew what and when. You can't charm your way out of a paper trail. You can't tweet your way out of a signed document. The evidence either exists or it doesn't. If Melania has provided testimony that places Ivanka in rooms where fraudulent conduct was discussed, or if she's authenticated documents that show Ivanka's direct involvement, that's the kind of evidence that changes cases. There's also the question of what Ivanka does now. Does she fight this aggressively? Does she seek to have the passport restriction lifted? Does she cooperate with investigators herself? Each of those choices has consequences. If she fights, she signals that she's not backing down. But she also prolongs the process and potentially exposes herself to more scrutiny. If she cooperates, she might reduce her own legal exposure, but she also provides information that could be used against others, including her father. That's the dilemma at the center of cases like this. Everyone is making calculations about their own interest versus the interest of the group. And in families, especially families where business and personal relationships are deeply intertwined, those calculations get complicated fast. Let's step back for a moment and think about the bigger picture. This isn't just about one person's passport. It's about accountability. It's about whether the rules apply to everyone or just to some people. It's about whether wealth and power insulate you from consequences, or whether, eventually, the legal system catches up. For years, we've watched investigations into the Trump family cycle through phases: announcements, subpoenas, court battles, delays. And a lot of people have become cynical about whether anything would actually happen, whether anyone would actually be held accountable. But taking someone's passport is not nothing. It's a concrete action with real consequences. It's the kind of step you take when you're building towards something, not when you're letting something fade away. The other thing to understand is that these investigations don't happen in isolation. There are multiple jurisdictions involved, multiple prosecutors, multiple sets of evidence, and they often coordinate. So when something happens in one case, it can have ripple effects in others. If Ivanka is restricted from travel in one investigation, that affects her options in any other legal matter she might be facing. If Melania has cooperated in one context, it raises questions about what else she might know and whether she'll be called to testify in other proceedings. This is not the end of the story. It's a chapter, but it's a significant chapter, and the direction it's pointing is clear. Let me leave you with this. In every major scandal, there are moments that people remember later as turning points. Moments when the outcome wasn't yet certain, but the trajectory shifted. When someone who seemed untouchable suddenly looked vulnerable. When the machinery of accountability, which had seemed slow or stalled, suddenly started moving with purpose. We might be in one of those moments. Ivanka's passport confiscated in a courtroom. Melania, behind closed doors, speaking to investigators. The walls, no longer theoretical, starting to close in for real. The question now is what comes next, and whether the people involved understand that the time for calculation and maneuvering is running out. Because the law, when it finally moves, doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for a convenient moment. It just moves. And once it does, passports don't matter much anyway.